You've seen castles in films, towers, banners, a lord surveying his land from the highest window. What the films never show you is the account book sitting on the table beside him. Owning a medieval castle wasn't a symbol of unlimited wealth. It was one of the most expensive, least liquid assets a family could hold in the entire medieval economy. An asset that came with a permanent bill attached, and almost no clean way to sell it off if things went wrong. By the end of this video, you'll understand exactly what it costs to build a castle, staff it, garrison it, and keep it standing, and where the money actually had to come from to cover all of it. Real figures pulled from treasury records that survive to this day. What a king spent, what a baron earned, and how fast that gap could ruin either one of them. Because the families who got this math wrong didn't just lose money. Some of them lost the castle. A few lost considerably more than that. Start with the biggest, best documented example in English history. Edward I's ring of castles across North Wales, built after his conquest in the 1280s. Carnarvon Castle alone cost the royal treasury somewhere between £20,000 and £25,000 over the 47 years it took to build, and even then it was never fully finished. Conwy Castle and its town walls came to roughly £15,500. Harlech, smaller and plainer, still ran to £8,190. Further south, older projects like Chateau Gallard in Normandy had already shown the same pattern a century earlier, coming in at around £12,000 for a single fortress. Add up Edward's full Welsh campaign, and the crown spent close to £80,000 between 1277 and 1304, climbing toward £95,000 by 1329. Peacetime crown revenue ran near £30,000 a year. Edward wasn't spending a slice of his income on castles. He was spending nearly 6 times his annual income, pulled from taxation, trade duties, and borrowed capital, on stone. A skilled mason or carpenter on those sites earned around 3 pence a day at 240 pence to the pound. A common laborer, less skilled and lower on the pay scale, might clear something close to £2 across an entire year. Run that math across a single tower, and you start to see why even a modest stone castle, nowhere near Carnarvon's scale, could still swallow a smaller lord's entire fortune, several times over, before the walls even reached full height. The building itself rarely came out of spare income. It came from mortgaging the future, years of tax revenue, feudal dues, and borrowed capital, all committed in advance to a structure that produced no income of its own. That's the real signal a castle sent. A family or a king who had found a way to survive being that deep in debt while looking unshakable from the outside. Not every castle was crown-funded like Carnarvon. Most were built by barons, and the money came from manor rents, feudal dues, and whatever a lord could borrow against future income. The scale was completely different from a royal project, but the underlying problem was identical. A castle had to be paid for years before it could be defended, and most of that money came from sources a lord didn't fully control. Crown finance leaned on a specific toolkit. The geld, a land tax assessed at 2 shillings per hide, brought in a steady baseline. Special levies like the Saladin Tithe of 1188 could pull in 10% of a subject's goods and revenue in a single year when the crown needed cash fast for a specific campaign. Barons paid scutage, a cash substitute for the knights they owed the king in military service, calculated at roughly 1 mark, 13 shillings and 4 pence, per knight's fee they held. None of these income streams were reliable year to year. Harvests failed. Wars interrupted trade. Tenants died, and rents lapsed until new arrangements were sorted out. A lord could plan a castle around 1 year's income and find that income cut in half by the time the walls were half built. Edward I felt this at the royal level. His Welsh campaign cost close to 6 times a full year of crown revenue, and it left the treasury exposed enough that a rebellion in 1294, led by Madag ap Llywelyn, added roughly £55,000 in emergency military spending on top of the original construction bill, plus more than £16,000 just to repair the damage done to Carnarvon itself. A king with the full machinery of English taxation behind him nearly broke the treasury building fortresses. A baron working off a single estate's harvest had far less room for error than that. A castle wasn't just walls. It was a small town, and every person inside it needed paying, feeding, or housing, usually all three at once. A large English castle carried a household of at least 50 staff. Cooks, grooms, carpenters, and masons kept on permanent retainer for ongoing repairs, falconers and musicians for entertaining guests, plus the steward who ran the accounts, and the marshal who managed the stables and the fighting men. Most of this staff were paid daily and let go the moment the lord traveled elsewhere, which kept costs flexible but meant almost nobody in the household had real job security. Senior staff were the exception. The chaplain, the steward, the marshal, paid annually and sometimes granted land of their own for long service. The steward's job alone shows how seriously this operation was run. He was expected to tour the estate's manors 2 or 3 times a year, checking rents, court fees, mill income, and woodland use against what was actually owed. By the 13th century, the role had become skilled enough that colleges in Oxford ran 6 to 12-month training courses in accounting and estate law, specifically to produce stewards capable of holding these numbers together. None of this shows up in the romantic version of castle life. But feeding, housing, and paying 50-plus people year-round, whether or not the harvest was good that season, was a fixed cost a lord carried regardless of income. It didn't pause for a bad year. A castle's household ran on the same logic as a company's payroll. The obligation kept accruing whether the revenue showed up or not. So, quick pause before we get into garrison wages and where the actual revenue was coming from, because that's where this gets genuinely brutal. If you're finding the real financial mechanics behind history useful, hit subscribe. This is exactly the kind of breakdown this channel runs every episode. Now the soldiers. Garrisoning a castle wasn't a one-time cost folded into construction. It was a recurring wage bill for as long as the castle stood, and surviving English pay record from the 14th century show exactly how tiered that bill was. Under a documented 1316 rate, a knight banneret earned 4 shillings a day, an ordinary knight 2 shillings, and a man-at-arms or squire 1 shilling. By 1346, standard garrison rolls had their own scale. A squires, constables, and seninars at 1 shilling a day, mounted archers at 6 pence, ordinary archers at 3 pence, and Welsh infantry at 2 pence. A single well-manned garrison, kept its strength through peacetime and war alike, could burn through more cash in a year than most manors brought in. There was an older system meant to soften this. Castle guard, a feudal obligation requiring certain manors or knights' fees to supply soldiers for a set number of days each year, free of wages. In theory, that spread the defense cost across a network of tenants instead of one treasury. In practice, most of that obligation got commuted early into a straight cash payment, a form of scutage known as castle guard rent, because chasing scattered tenants for a few weeks of guard duty apiece proved harder to administer than simply charging them and hiring professionals instead. The theoretical free army a lord was owed under feudal law rarely showed up as free labor. It showed up as another cash figure on the ledger, collected from tenants and paid straight back out to whoever was actually willing to stand on the wall. Where did the money come from to cover all of this? Almost entirely from land, structured through the knight's fee. By the reigns of Henry II and Edward II, a knight's fee was assessed at around £20 a year in produce and rents, drawn from an estate typically between 1,000 and 5,000 acres. That income wasn't a clean salary. It came in through rents from tenant farmers, fees from the manor court, tolls on the mill every villager was legally required to use, and dues owed on specific occasions, like when a lord's eldest son was knighted or his eldest daughter married. A knight or baron didn't check a bank balance. He collected grain, livestock, court fines, and cash rents from dozens of small transactions scattered across a season, and converted whatever he could into coin whenever the treasury or a merchant needed paying. This is why castle economics stayed so fragile. A knight's fee valued at £20 a year on paper could deliver far less in a bad harvest, and there was no reserve fund sitting behind it, no diversified income stream to smooth out the gap. Barons at the upper end pulled in £200 to £500 a year or more. Earls ranged anywhere from £400 to over £11,000, depending entirely on how much land they held and how well it was managed. But even the wealthiest of them ran an operation where nearly all revenue traced back to a single asset class: agricultural land, subject to weather, disease, and the health of the people working it. A modern company diversifies its revenue to survive a bad quarter. A medieval lord's entire income statement was one line item: the land and whatever it happened to produce the particular year. A finished castle wasn't a one-time purchase. Stone walls needed repointing, lead roofing needed replacing before it failed and let water into the timber below, and timber itself rotted, especially on a coastline like North Wales, where salt air accelerated every kind of decay. The scale of that ongoing build depended entirely on the castle's size. A smaller fortification, backed by a modest surrounding estate, might be kept in reasonable repair for a few pounds a year. Conwy Castle, one of Edward's major fortresses, was a different story entirely. Its constable was given an annual allowance of £190 specifically for upkeep, close to what an earl at the lower end of the income scale earned from his entire estate in a year. That's the real trap in castle ownership. The most expensive castles to build were also the most expensive to keep standing, and that second cost never had a finish line. Construction eventually stopped. Even at Carnarvon, it effectively stopped, unfinished, once the money ran out. Maintenance ran for as long as the family held the property, which for the largest fortresses could mean centuries of stonework, roofing, and carpentry, charged every single year against income that stayed roughly flat while the work never did. Running a castle didn't exempt a lord from paying his own obligations upward. The crown still expected its geld, its occasional aids for events like a royal wedding or a crusade, and scudded from anyone who held land by knight service and hadn't personally shown up to fight. These weren't small, symbolic payments. The Saladin tithe of 1188 demanded a tenth of a subject's goods and revenue in a single year to fund a crusade. Import and export duties, introduced in 1202 at a rate of 1/15 of the value of traded goods, added another drain on any lord whose estate did meaningful trade. None of these taxes cared whether a lord had just spent a fortune on castle repairs or garrison wages that same year. A medieval lord sat in the middle of a system pulling money from two directions at once: downward, from tenants whose harvest could fail without warning, and upward, to a crown that assessed its taxes on paper wealth rather than the cash actually sitting in a lord's coffers in any given season. Staying solvent meant timing both flows correctly in a period with no banking system built to smooth out the gap between them. All of this assumed peacetime. War changed the math completely. When Madog ap Llywelyn led a Welsh revolt against Edward's new castles in 1294 and 1295, the fighting alone cost the crown around £55,000 in emergency military spending, on top of the £80,000 already spent building the castles the rebellion targeted. Carnarvon took serious damage in the uprising, and repairing it cost more than £16,000 on its own, money that had to be found immediately, not planned years in advance the way construction budgets usually were. That's the risk nobody prices in when they picture castle economics as a fixed, one-time investment. A siege, a rebellion, or a rival lord's raid could undo years of careful budgeting in a single season, and the response wasn't optional. A damaged castle controlling a hostile region had to be rebuilt immediately at whatever emergency rate contractors could be found, because leaving it half-ruined invited the next attack. War turned a tight but manageable annual budget into an unplanned capital expense with no negotiating power attached. You paid what it cost to fix the walls before the next assault arrived, and you paid it now. So after building costs, staffing, garrison wages, repairs, and taxes flowing in both directions, did a castle ever pay for itself in cash terms? Mostly no. Very few castles ran anything close to a profit the way a mill or a market town could. What a castle actually purchased was control. Control of a road, a river crossing, a hostile population, or a border. Carnarvon existed to hold North Wales after conquest, not to turn a return on trade or tourism. Its value showed up in tax revenue the crown could now safely collect from a pacified region. in trade that could move through a controlled crossing without being raided, and the simple fact that a rival couldn't easily take that land back once it was fortified. That return was real, but it was indirect and slow. A baron building a smaller castle on his own land was often buying the same thing at a personal scale. The ability to enforce his own manor courts, collect his own rents without a rival lord contesting them, and hold a seat at the table when regional power got divided up. The castle was infrastructure for extracting value from everything around it, not a value-generating asset in its own right. Judged as an investment with a payback period, most castles were a poor bet. Judged as the fixed cost of holding and taxing a territory over decades, they were often the only option a lord actually had. This whole economic arrangement had a shelf life. Gunpowder artillery, widely used in siege warfare by the 15th century, could breach walls that had held for 200 years against anything short of prolonged starvation. Suddenly, the enormous fixed cost of thick stone walls bought far less military value than it used to, while the running costs, garrison, maintenance, staffing stayed exactly the same. At the same time, kings were building more centralized tax systems and standing armies, reducing the need for a network of privately garrisoned fortresses to hold territory on the crown's behalf. A castle that once justified its expense by controlling a region became, in many cases, an expensive relic that a more efficient state no longer needed a baron to maintain. Many families made the obvious financial move. They stopped garrisoning, let the fortifications decay, and converted what remained into a comfortable manor house instead, built for living rather than defending, without the recurring wage bill a real garrison demanded. The walls that once justified themselves through control of territory couldn't do the same through comfort alone. So most castles outlived their economic reason for existing long before they physically fell down. So that's the real ledger behind a medieval castle, an asset that cost a fortune to build, more to defend, and more again to maintain, and one that rarely paid any of it back in direct income. Control was the actual return, paid out slowly through tax revenue and territory rather than cash in hand. But castles weren't the only fortified medieval assets built around that kind of indirect return. Ports were too, and the economics behind a medieval port run almost in reverse. Instead of a fortress that cost money to hold territory, you're looking at infrastructure that could generate direct trade income for centuries, while carrying its own brutal set of risks, piracy, blockade, and a rival town undercutting your tolls at every turn. I've put together the same kind of breakdown for that side of the medieval economy. If you want to see why some ports made their owners genuinely wealthy while most castles never did, the next video covers the economics of owning a medieval port.